20 years, a failed state. Somalia isn't quite out of the woods yet. There is a groundswell of hope, though, and a government in Mogadishu. But insecurity remains widespread, with Al-Qaeda-linked insurgents still holding on to many areas of the country, despite an ongoing UN-backed AMISOM campaign to rout the militants. Let's take a look.
20 years, a failed state. Poverty and insecurity remain widespread in the Horn of Africa country. 1 in every 10 children dies before age 5. Those who survive aren't confident they'll see their 50th birthday. Behind this tragedy is a rogue US policy. Weeks before President Bill Clinton took office, his predecessor, George H.W. Bush, had deployed American soldiers to Somalia. The 1992-1993 US-led intervention ended in disaster when 18 US servicemen were killed in the Battle of Mogadishu. Scenes of US soldiers being dragged on the streets of Mogadishu by militants shocked Americans. It's this incident that gave birth to the epic movie Black Hawk Down. For the next 18 years, the US scaled down its involvement in Somalia politics, but embarked on an even more sinister mission. US policy in Somalia became preoccupied with searching out, capturing and killing suspected perpetrators of those attacks. It is then that the seeds of later US policy in Somalia were planted. Somalia's sad state after the fall of Siad Barre in 1991 is well known. Warlords took control of the country, which led to famine, fighting, and lack of any central governmental authority. The US was roundly criticized for setting Somalia on the path of self-destruction by putting a premium on its efforts to capture or kill a small number of high-level suspects. Its policy of funding secular militias in fighting terrorism in the Horn of Africa country is believed to have triggered counterattacks by Islamists. Somalia also became a playfield for US proxy wars. The use of Ethiopian soldiers, for example, was seen by the US as an awkward but necessary way to prevent Somalia from being ruled by an Islamic government unsympathetic to American interests. Using the CIA in its counter-terrorism strategy, the US armed and bankrolled secular warlords to avoid sending its own US troops, a policy disapproved even by the US own State Department. In the end, and by design, the US created a monster in Somalia that speeded the country's descent into anarchy. In 2006, Somalia's interim president Abdullahi Yusuf of the Transitional Federal Government criticized American support for non-state actors. We really oppose American aid that goes outside the government. The best way to hunt members of Al-Qaeda in Somalia is to strengthen the government, he was quoted saying. In early January 2011, it was reported that the US, probably the CIA, hit its first target in Somalia with a drone strike, which worsened the security situation in Somalia.
Now, the United States stands accused for much of what Somalia became over the years. So to what extent did the US policy accelerate Somalia's descent into a failed state? Well, joining us to discuss this from Washington, D.C., is Peter Pham, Africa Center Director of the Atlantic Council. Professor Pham was previously Senior Vice President of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and editor of its bi-monthly journal, American Foreign Policy Interests. From Mogadishu is Honorable Hussein Arab Isse, a Member of Parliament in Somalia and a former Defense Minister. And in studio here with me is Professor Peter Kagwanja, the Chief Executive, Africa Policy Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I'm going to start off with you, Professor Pham, in Washington. Now, the United States stands accused of much of what happened to Somalia in later years after the fall of Siad Barre. Do you agree?
Certainly not. Somalia's destiny has always been in the hands of its own people. The collapse of the Siad Barre regime came about because the regime lost its legitimacy. It had carried out a genocidal war in the north, and in the south, its oppression and clan favoritism led its own people to rise up against it. So it certainly brought about its own fall. Since then, certainly many warlords as well as Islamist groups and including some terrorists have fought over Somalia. But ultimately, the problem is not interference from the outside community, international community, but rather the failure of the international community to simply let Somalia and Somalis themselves decide their own destiny. It's your country if you can hold it, and that ultimately stands true for every country. Other countries will simply look after their own interests and their legitimate security interests, including Kenya, Ethiopia, and others. But it's up to Somalis themselves to seize their own destiny and to rebuild their society from within. It can't be done from the outside.
All right, Mr. Hussein Arabi says Somalia brought about its own demise. That is the suggestion from Professor Peter Pham.
Well, yes, well said, Professor. I think I truly agree with you. The solution lies within the Somali people. We have to bring the solutions ourselves. We cannot always look to the outside for solutions, because more often than not, you know, from the outside, the outside interference usually creates more problems for us. I agree with you. After the collapse of the Siad Barre regime, you know, instead of us, you know, Somalis coming together and trying to salvage whatever we could, we actually turned on each other for you know, selfish reasons, clan, you know, differences and all kinds of self-interests. And the result is what you see today, you know, 24 years later. You know, we are considered, you know, a failed state,
right.
And we still haven't been able to recover from the problem. So it is self-inflicted, and the solution will come from the Somalis themselves.
Professor Kagwanja.
I think the answer to that is longer than perhaps the question presupposes. First, the crisis in Somalia before Siad Barre or during Siad Barre was largely fueled by the US, because it is the one that maintained the dictator. I mean, the funding to Siad Barre alone was so huge, you can't believe it. So that during the Cold War, Somalia was part and parcel of the US strategic calculations in the Indian Ocean and the Horn of Africa. After the fall of Siad Barre, America did what it needed to do as a superpower. It intervened in Somalia and encouraged the international community, including the UN, to intervene in Somalia. But because of its own internal contradictions in regard to its policy, it retreated so quickly just because the Black Hawk went down and abandoned Somalia, and with it, the entire international community had a mass walkout out of the country.
Right.
The result is what you've seen in the last 20 years.
Professor Pham, your view there on the process that led to the decline of Somalia was largely as a result of US geopolitics prior to 1991.
Well, I would say that during that period of time, the internal, certainly the U.S. was partnered for a long time with the Siad Barre dictatorship, but it was the internal dynamics of that own regime that brought about its failure. Its adherence to the so-called MOD coalition of Siad Barre's own clan, the Mazartan, with the Ogaden and the Dubahante. It was his own it was the internal dynamic, exclusivity, which led other clans to rebel, and also his attempt to change Somali society forcibly to his vision of socialism. So really, there were geopolitics at stake in the Horn, no denying that, but ultimately it was the failure of the regime to build an internal legitimacy and inclusiveness, and it's been the ongoing competition by various interests that have up to now led to repeated failures. The current federal government of Somalia is, depending on how you count them, the 14th or 16th attempt to reestablish a central government since then. We wish them well, but ultimately it's the inclusiveness of the regime and its legitimacy which will enable it to survive. Outsiders can't do that. We can help, we can provide assistance,
right.
But ultimately it's for Somalis themselves.
All right. How much of the U.S. policy, though, in 1991, though, has led to what Somalia has become today?
I think the withdrawal of the U.S. prematurely emboldened internal forces that were armed to start creating enclaves of authority within that country. Remember, Somalia is not collapsed as an economy, if this is the argument that is made. If you talk about the collapse of Somalia, we don't talk about the collapse of the economy. The economy has been vibrant. The question is the central authority, and it could not establish when we have so many warlords who are emboldened by a lack of a common international approach to Somalia. One can actually accuse the international community of abdication as far as the Somalia is concerned. And it was until the African Union and its forces were formed in 2004 that attention began to be directed towards Somalia. So Somalia is a typical case of the Africans themselves putting their act together and intervening in a neighbor in order to bring order when the international community has disappeared. But we can basically recognize that the UN has done a good job to support the AMISOM forces in Somalia.
All right, Professor Pham, the international community, the United States, abdicated from Somalia after the debacle of 1994. Give us your insights to that.
Well, my response to that is simple. Nations, whether large or small, pursue their own interests. And insofar as the United States had no core interests in Somalia, it had no business being involved. It's not an abdication because there is no responsibility. It only is when the United States, as any other country, intervenes in another sovereign country only insofar as it pushes upon their interests or threatens them. In the case of Somalia, the issues of terrorism and piracy. Other than that, internally, it's really up to the Somalis themselves. I would argue the United States has no responsibility to go in and rebuild the Somali state, except insofar as that its own national interests are at stake.
Well, the United States has no responsibility in your words, but I just want to come up here with a quote by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. In later years, he did mention that it was wrong for the United States government to support warlords in Somalia, and that was in response, though, to allegations that the United States was funding the Alliance for the Restoration of Peace and Counter-Terrorism, that umbrella body. I mean, can the U.S. really say it has no responsibility in rebuilding Somalia?
I would say, look, I think you're comparing apples and oranges. The point is, the United States, like any other country, will pursue its own security interests, just as Kenya has in Somalia, just as Ethiopia has. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's simply the nature of the international state system. I was a critic, by the way, back in 2004, 5, and 6 of U.S. policy in Somalia, precisely because I thought backing warlords was not a way forward. However, I will say that in a sense, it was a misguided policy to picking those warlords, but it was an understandable reaction in the absence of a state structure with which one could work to curb questions of and challenges from extremists, and some with very long-standing links to international terrorist organizations.
Professor Kagwanja.
Ultimately, I think the international community is best served by creating a space allowing Somalis to develop their own solutions and not trying to prejudge the conclusion.
All right.
I agree. Ultimately, the responsibility to bring Somalia back to its feet and to rebuild it and to cast a vision for the future rests with the Somali people. That is true. It's indisputable. What is disputable, though, is the following: that the time we are talking about the abandonment or abdication of Somalia is the same time when the world is globally described as unipolar. In other words, we have a one-power state, and that most of the states in the world had obligations and looked to America for guidance on how to move into the future. And we are talking about 1991 to around 2000. That is what has been described by experts as the uni-polar moment. And the entire globe looked to America to help us shape the new world order or new world dispensation. And Somalia is an unfortunate failure in that attempt to craft a new global dispensation. After 2002, we get the the multipolar world, which is why Somalia is beginning to come together, because there are more actors than the United States.
Right.
And therefore, Somalia's hope and future is at one point dependent on what the Somalis themselves are going to do, and two, on what support they are going to get from the global community.
All right. Honorable Arab Isse, you've heard the sentiments from Washington, you've heard the sentiments from Nairobi. Let's get your perspective there from Somalia. What is the general feeling, though, about the United States and the role of the United States in Somalia post-1991, as America is thinking of sending an envoy back to Somalia again after 20 years?
I think it's an excellent move that the Americans are finally, thinking of, returning to Somalia in a diplomatic way. However, one point that we need to go back to is the fact right after 91, in 93 when the U.S. came in under the humanitarian umbrella, I think you remember they were received very well by the Somali people, and they've always been regarded by Somali people in a very welcoming manner. However, as you know, quickly turned into a military operation, and that I think created a problem, for the Somalis and the Americans as well. Had we stuck to the original plan, I think we would have been gone down a different road. Had they stayed a little longer or withdrawn in a more systematic manner, to make sure that we were not just left in the hands of a bunch of warlords fighting for power, I think it would have saved us many years.
Honorable Hussein Arab Isse, Member of Parliament, will take a short break. And also still with us in Washington, D.C., Peter Pham, Africa Center Director of the Atlantic Council, and Professor Peter Kagwanja, the Chief Executive, Africa Policy. Gentlemen, to stay with us. We'll return in a moment. Welcome back to the program. Now, can the United States justify its involvement in Somalia? Well, still with us on the show from Washington, D.C., Professor Peter Pham, Africa Center Director of the Atlantic Council. From Mogadishu, Honorable Hussein Arab Isse, Member of Parliament and former Defense Minister. And in studio with me, Professor Peter Kagwanja, Chief Executive, Africa Policy Institute. Gentlemen, thank you. Professor Pham, I'll come to you on this. Can the United States justify its involvement in Somalia in the 1990s?
You keep returning to the 1990s. The fact is, the 1990s, the U.S. intervened in Somalia at the head of an international mission to open up a humanitarian corridor. I think certainly that was a noble enterprise. When the enterprise did not go very well, when the attacks, the Black Hawk Down incident, the United States drew back. And in that sense, it did not abdicate responsibility. It simply acted in its own national interest. The national interest of the United States in Somalia is twofold. One is the prevention of extremism and terrorism from taking root in the Horn of Africa and threatening the United States, its interests, and those of its allies. And two, preventing piracy and other disorders that threaten international trade and commerce. Beyond that, internally, the U.S. should be modest and recognize that where we can, where we have a partner, as we seem to have today, we should assist the legitimate government, properly constituted, insofar as our resources allow, in fighting those enemies and establishing stability. But beyond that, we don't have an interest, nor should we have a role in deciding the future of Somalia. I think the idea that the U.S., you keep returning to the 1990s. The 1990s are past. We have to look to the future and what the international community and Somalis can do to build a future instead of revisiting a period of history that is long past 20 years.
All right, Professor Kagwanja.
If you look at all the literature that is written, one of the things you'll find is the projections of America's foreign policy interest as the promotion of democracy, human rights, and freedom.
But Professor Pham argues that the responsibility of rebuilding Somalia and stabilizing Somalia lies with the Somali people, not with the United States.
It is true that the initiative shaping the destiny of the country called Somalia, deciding what they want to become, is the responsibility of the Somali people. But do they have the resources? Do they have the technical know-how after 20 years of destruction and Prada? The international community has a moral obligation, and Somalia remains a sore spot in the conscience of humanity. And abdicating responsibility to rebuild Somalia is going to haunt the international community morally. It doesn't matter how strongly we argue about the self-interest doctrine in global politics or international relations. Self-interest has its own limits if you begin to look at it that way, because the United States does not only have interest in Somalia about extremism, it has other geostrategic interest in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in Djibouti, and the neighboring countries. Yet these countries are hemorrhaging because of the abandonment of Somalia. So where do you draw the line between interest in Somalia and interest in the neighboring states?
All right, Professor Pham.
Well, I would respond, yes, the U.S. has broad interests, but it cannot, we are, as much as some of the neocons and others would say otherwise, the United States has limited resources. We are facing fiscal challenges at home. Our military resources have been stretched by 2 wars. So there's a limit to what one can do. I don't disagree with my colleague in Kenya that if insofar as it is possible and within our means, certainly we should help. But I think one has to be realistic about what the United States is able to commit and not raise expectations beyond. We're a democracy like Kenya is a democracy, and our people at this point are fatigued. And realistically, I think one should not expect the United States to do more unless a case can be made to the American people that direct national interests are involved. The American people are not at this period in history willing or able to sustain nation-building projects abroad. Right. President Obama himself says that it's time to rebuild the American homeland.
All right, the United States is unwilling and probably not able. So what next?
It is true. The argument has been made that the United States is a declining power or a declining superpower. For a variety of reasons, including its own economic decline, meaning that it can no longer bankroll many international projects that it used to bankroll. Therefore, it is true that we must temper our expectations from the former superpower, our own superpower. But as long as the United States continue to project its military prowess in the rest of the world, as long as it continue to give guidance and to be the dominant force in the United Nations Security Council, as long as it continue to have the final say in global issues, then it has reciprocal responsibility to have the first voice on the good things like rebuilding Somalia.
All right. Professor, do you agree? Professor Pham in Washington?
Well, I would respond simply that yes, we have a role to play, but the role, certainly Kenya would expect us to have a greater role because Somalia is on Kenya's doorstep and it directly impacts Kenya. But we have an entire globe to look at. And so I think one has to be realistic that with an entire globe, husbanding our resources, we have to decide what are our priorities. And quite frankly, as much as my friends in the Horn of Africa would like us to focus greater attention or more resources, I'm saying realistically, we will only do so much. The rest is really up to regional partners of Somalia and ultimately the Somali people. The Somali dynamism should be allowed also given rein to take their own destiny in their own hands.
All right, a very dynamic discussion here, but we're going to wind up in a moment. Professor Kagwanja, I saw you smile there, and while you add your voice to whatever caused that smile, I just want to put it to you, though, that in your view, how do you propose the international community respond to Somalia today, particularly the United States, because you insist that they abdicated their responsibility there in Somalia some 20 years ago?
There are two ways of doing it. First, is not to assume that Somalia is a post-conflict reconstruction case. It is not. It is still deeply steeped in conflict. And Al-Shabaab is as alive as it were. Its tactics are better perhaps than they were 3 years ago, and it is a lethal force even as we speak. Beyond that, the regional actors like Kenya, the African Union, and all Somalia's neighbors must come in and help where they can. The international community, the European Union, America itself, and others, China, India, and others must come and help Somalia to rebuild. So it's a collective effort to rebuild Somalia. I wouldn't say it is a U.S. effort to rebuild Somalia. But remember, the leadership of the world is given by the U.S. Where the U.S. directs its attention, the world moves. The problem with Somalia is that the U.S. has not yet directed its attention to Somalia sufficiently.
All right, Professor Peter Pham, as the United States makes a return to Somalia, how do you propose that the United States should respond to Somalia as it stands today?
Well, Peter just mentioned the African Union work, both the AMISOM mission as well as other African, much of which is still heavily supported by billions of dollars in U.S. funding over the last few years. So we're already supporting the African solutions to this African problem. The United States can also certainly provide technical support, some advice. In the last few days, word has been leaked out of the fact that the U.S. has had a modest military presence in Somalia for some time, advising both the African Union and the Somali National Army. And I think those efforts can continue. And so they're modest efforts. It's not going to be the great Marshall Plan that people occasionally bring up, but it's there. And I think it's as much engagement as the American public and the American Congress and people are willing to put up with at the moment.
All right, Mr. Hussein Arabise, you have the final word on this from Somalia.
Well, I think, the Somalis, I think, have, had enough of the situation we've lived in for the last 24 years. We are ready to help ourselves. But I think there is a moral obligation, I think, for the rest of the world to step up to the plate and assist us in truly standing on our 2 feet. And I think, as we know, the rest of the world shutting its eyes and leaving us kind of created a safe haven for Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda, who now is a common enemy for all humanity.
All right, Professor Peter Kagwanja, Chief Executive, Africa Policy Institute, in studio here with us in Nairobi. And from Washington, D.C., Peter Pham, Africa Center Director of the Atlantic Council, and in Mogadishu, Honorable Hussein Arabise, a Member of Parliament and a former Defense Minister in Somalia, joining us there from the capital, Mogadishu. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your insightful debate. I'm Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. Goodbye.